So I'll start by announcing Dr. Fred Turek. He's a professor of biology at Northwestern University and the director for Center for Sleep and Circadian Biology. Research in his lab is focused on the study of sleep and circadian rhythms, with special interest in identifying genes that regulate sleep and circadian rhythms. And you can see the title of his talk here is Overview of Circadian Disruption, Biomarkers, and Experimental Models. Thank you, Dr.
Thank you, and thank you for inviting me to give this opening. I'm supposed to finish in about 30 minutes, and my goal is to try to set the tone for the meeting, to cover some of the major questions that we will be addressing. Not all of them, but at some of the broader issues that we will be covering. And I think everyone has their own favorite slide of the Earth from space. This is the one I happen to like, showing the light at night from NASA-related activities in late 50, middle 70, 97, 2005, and you can see the explosion of the light at night. And this hit me this morning when I was reading an article about drone technology in the use of drones in the United States now, not just in war zones, and how somebody made the point that the technology with the drones is moving so fast the regulators are way behind. And I think that's a good analogy here, that this has taken place, sort of an explosion, if you look at this, and yet the regulations that are involved and what we're doing about it from a health point of view, safety point of view. Being from Chicago, I couldn't help pull this one in, particularly since I live right in the middle of that area. And there's a book out called Air. And I think he's taking 10 major cities. I just ordered the book now. I got it off a website, showing light at night from different beautiful angles. And it's beautiful to look at, but the question is what impact is it having on our health and well-being. And I'm really glad that Audrey Fisher is here today. She introduced herself because I decided to put this slide in just to make the point that this actually has implications that go beyond even what we're talking about today. Audrey, in her wisdom, invited Kristen Knudsen and myself to talk at the Adler Planetarium in Chicago on November 15th, so not too long ago, because the Adler Planetarium and their associates are interested in what are the unintended consequences of light at night, what is light pollution, what impact is it having on our health and well-being, as well as the ecology that we live in the cities. So I didn't know Audrey was going to be here, so I'm really glad I put that slide in. Okay, so I'm going to go from the pathway from light to disease. And of course, light at night, we all know about these issues here. And I'm going to just say a word about sleep loss. We're not really talking a lot about sleep loss, but I will interject it in occasionally in this opening, because I think we have to keep it in mind for a number of reasons. And you see the various conditions which have been associated with sleep loss and many health consequences. And I'd like to show this slide. I got to move them here, because it's amazing the range of things the health issues that have been related to inadequate sleep, whether it's depression, obesity, a lot of data now showing it alters appetite-regulating hormones. People will have a desire for greater food intake, depending on how much sleep they've had. The diabetic community, the diabetes community is getting interested in lack of sleep. Cardiovascular community is getting interested. When I say getting interested, I'm going to then qualify that in a minute. Impaired performance, accidents, and mortality. But actually, when I look at this, I have to be honest with myself. I think that we've made huge inroads in bringing the diabetes community, the body weight regulation community. They all get it now, that sleep and circadian rhythms, which I'm going to get to next, is involved. You disrupt those, and you're going to have an impact. And Dr. Van Carter pointed out to me that she looked at the latest guidelines from the American Diabetes Association about how to, deal with your diabetes, how to prevent it, or at least attenuate your symptoms and that, and sleep was not even mentioned. So sometimes within our community, we think we've really reached out, and that's a theme I'm going to keep coming back to, particularly because we're here at the NIH, so let me put the broader term there, the NIH, and we want to try to engage the various institutes that should be interested in the disrupted sleep and rhythms. Now, with respect to accidents, I think we finally hit it. Mark Rosekind is head of the National Highway Transportation Safety NHTSA. That's 40,000 people, and he's a sleep expert. And he was on the board of directors, only 5, of the National Transportation Safety Board. So I think we've impacted, the public is getting lack of sleep, circadian disruption from an accident point of view. This was that little train that got, hair, and the conductor fell asleep at 2 o'clock in the morning. So I think we've managed to get it across to the public relative to accidents, but I think we're way behind in getting across to a lot of other communities. So now, what I'm more interested in covering is the circadian disruption and how it has multiple impacts on health and disease. And again, the idea is that our internal clocks are not always in synchrony with our external lifestyle. And it's not just shift work, and it's not just jet lag. You're going to see it's social jet lag, which I'll refer to. It's people who are staying up all night with their iPhones, their iPads, social media. I actually was close to getting working with people in the Chicago Mercantile Exchange to see if traders at 4 o'clock in the morning were making more mistakes when they were trading with Hong Kong and Shanghai than they were during the daytime. We never got around to that. It was over wine, and we never got into that study. But I think we don't realize it's really almost everyone in society is impacted in our society. I do have a slide. I don't know if this is politically correct. I do have a slide of the world from space, and there's actually one industrial country in the world you don't have to worry about light at night. You just look at the map of the whole world, and you see China, and you see Japan, you see South Korea, and then all of a sudden you see this black spot. There's no lights in North Korea. I think we all agree we don't want to go back. We don't want to be like North Korea, so how do we deal with the issues? We do have light at night, even if they don't. Okay, this... Yeah, this is the one. I put this in particular. We're going to be talking. Other people will be talking about shift work, but I put this up. This was a report from the Office of Technology Assessment. Most of you are probably too young to even know what an OTA was. It was the research arm of Congress. They got rid of it in around 1983. They didn't want any research, so they ended up getting rid of the OTA. But the OTA came out with this report on shift work. And so this goes back 83, 93, long time ago, 30 years ago. And what was in the article was how day workers compared to shift workers looking at circulatory disease, digestive disease. This is how many years they had been on the job. And of course, as more years on the job, the older you're getting, so you're more likely to have circulatory or digestive disease. But you can see that the shift workers, and I don't know if any disease process, whether it's Alzheimer's, whether it's cardiovascular, whether it's diabetes, neurological disorders, I don't know of any process in which shift workers do not show a higher preponderance of the disorder than non-shift workers. I can't find anything. And now, to complicate the matters with shift workers, of course, I particularly like to show this slide, again, an old slide, that day workers are sleeping about 7 hours. With respect to rotating shift workers, on the evening shift or permanent, they're actually sleeping a little more because they don't have to get up in the morning. But the night shift workers, the ones who are working the midnight to 8 o'clock, 7 o'clock in the morning, you can see they're getting 1 to 2 hours less sleep a night. So that's a real complication if you want to know, is it sleep loss or circadian disruption or other factors? And I think the bottom line, we're coming to the conclusion, sleep loss is bad for you per se. Circadian disruption, bad for you per se. And if you add the two together, you sort of got a double whammy. Okay, let's talk a little bit about the biology. I think everyone in this room knows that in 1972, if you don't know the exact date, but you know that it was discovered that we had the suprachiasmatic nucleus was the location. It took about 10 years to convince everybody, but at least the initial studies is the location of a master circadian clock in our brain. This is when I started. Life was simple. Master circadian clock in the anterior hypothalamus, suprachiasmatic nucleus, light information from the retina in mammals, in lower mammals. In lower vertebrates, it's actually extraretinal photoreceptors. We're not going there today. But I will make the point that in around 2000, 2001, it was discovered that the rods and the cones were not the primary photoreceptor relaying information to the non-visual suprachiasmatic nucleus to regulate circadian rhythms. It was blue light sensitive retinal ganglion cells. And I think we'll hear a lot at this meeting about the importance of the wavelength of light. And then this clock was regulating all these output rhythms. Okay. Now so in the early days, we were describing rhythms, we were looking at the physiological basis, role of the suprachiasmatic nucleus, and we were pretty much focusing on things like shift work and jet lag. But there's been a rapid revolution in circadian clock field in its role in health and disease. And I like to show these sort of, I call it sometimes the two pillars. Oops. And the rapid evolution occurred, I think I could argue for this. We began to uncover the genetic and molecular basis of the circadian clock sort of in the late 1990s, mid-2000, and then since 2005 to now, what's really shocked everyone is how many other cellular pathways are affected by the circadian clock system. I'll get back to that in a minute. So once we began to recognize that these pathways, the clock system, the molecular clock was affecting multiple pathways, all of a sudden, many of the disorders that we've already referred to as being affected by circadian clock function began to say, hey, is it involved in cancer? Is it involved in gastrointestinal disorders? What role is the clock playing? And at the same time, that since we're beginning to see that studies have been being done showing that if you disrupt the rhythms, you disrupt sleep, you're more likely to have mental disorders, cancer, that fed into providing more money for the basic research. And so I think it's been like a good positive feedback loop. So I'm not going to get into the genetic basis of the clock, but I want to bring it up for one reason that you're going to see in a minute, because it changed our whole thinking about the role of the circadian clock in health and disease. So we discovered a mutant animal in Northwestern, Takahashi, Larry Pinto, Martha Vita Turner, myself, in about 1994. And the mutant animal, I'm not going to go into it, this is a mouse, a normal mouse that's not mutant, has a period of about 23.7 hours when it goes into constant darkness. And the mutant animal I won't even go into how we made the animal, had a period that was 1 hour longer. And if we do the proper mating in that, we get a homozygous animal, and they had a period of 28 hours. Now, this was, and Takahashi then led the group that within 3 years cloned the gene at Northwestern. And it was a gene that was unknown, 100,000 base pairs, a single base substitution from an A to a T transversion, and you go from being a normal animal to being essentially arrhythmic, really long period, sometimes arrhythmic. And it was a domino effect. Once that gene was found, and we went back to the fly story, because the fly people were discovering genes, we quickly found, within a few years, the major genes that were regulating the circadian clock system, the molecular clock. And this is the most simple version I can give to you, and I only want to show it here of showing how it's a transcriptional, translational, positive, negative feedback loop, simply to say the molecular clock was discovered. Great, really exciting, but that wasn't really the exciting discovery. When we started looking where the clock genes, we were going into the suprachiasmatic nucleus, and we peaked in the heart, we peaked in the liver, and oh my God, the circadian clock genes are in all the tissues of the body. And a number of ways of putting it. This one is the clocks within us, genes in the liver, pancreas, and other tissues, not just the brain, keep the various parts of your body in synchrony. Timing miscues may lead to diabetes, depression, and other illnesses. This appeared in Scientific American a year ago, and that was their kind of cute, clever drawing of it. This was one that one of my students drew so she could get her own picture into all the talks I give. I always show this slide. And it's this basic idea that the clocks are in all the cells of the body, on all the tissues of the body. An exception, which we have no understanding is the male testis. The clocks have not been found in the testis. I don't know why, but let's forget, they're not important anyway. So they're in all the cells of the body, and then, I don't have a slide to show this because it keeps changing. Originally, the original studies that came out looked at expressed transcripts in the heart, the liver, the kidney, and it was found that 10 to 20% of all the genes in the pancreas are cycling. And they're cycling because the molecular clock is telling them when and how to cycle. John Hoganash at the University of Pennsylvania is now claiming 50%. Now think about that for just 1 minute. If the molecular circadian clock is regulating 50% of all the expressed genes in all the tissues of your body, brain, heart, kidney, what happens when that goes bad? What happens when you begin to lose temporal organization within the cell? And one can talk about fat cells, one can talk about insulin secretion, insulin sensitivity, immune system, cardiovascular, food absorption. We now call these the peripheral clocks. And this next slide is pretty important, actually. It comes from a review of Steve Reppert, David Weaver. in nature, but it makes one really important point. So what they did was they took, and a lot of people were doing it at the same time, taking tissues out of the body, putting them in a dish, showing that they would cycle. Even though kidney cells are in a dish, liver cells are in a dish, they're showing 24-hour rhythms. But this is the important part here. So this is something we'll be coming to grips with during this entire day and a half that we're here. Yeah, we still got the top banana of the suprachiasmatic nucleus. But it regulates all these peripheral systems. But how does it regulate? That's the key. There's some direct neural connections. It regulates 24-hour rhythms and hormones, which then can affect downstream rhythms in peripheral tissues. And this is the one that we're not paying enough attention to, I think. The clock regulates feeding behavior. Feeding behavior then regulates a whole host of 24-hour rhythms in peripheral tissues. It regulates the sleep-wake cycle. That, whether you're sleeping or not, is going to be regulating downstream rhythms. And that's, I think, a key point here is that that's not the way we're supposed to be. All other animals, my mice, my hamsters, they never stay up late. They never read books. They never go to movies. They listen to their clock in their brain, which tells it, let's go, let's eat, let's sleep. They don't go to movies. They listen to their clock. We are the only species that does not listen to our clock. We override it. And what are the implications of that? Okay, I want to talk about the breadth of it from an NIH perspective. This is my NIH slide, so to speak. Is circadian dysregulation end? And I'm going to show you each one of these workshops. I attended, and I'm sure there are more, and other people can bring up other workshops. But this just shows you the breadth which people are beginning to understand. And I hope that whatever comes out of this, all of these NIHs has a seat at the table. That's probably a word I would want to use. Okay, National Institute of Mental Health, 2008, had a workshop, circadian disruption and depression. Not to be outdone, heart, lung, blood. Michael Turek might have even been at it. Had, in 2009, a workshop. In fact, you may have organized it, right? Yeah, you organized it. Well, that's being at it. And of course, what is the importance of the circadian clock system for heart, lung, blood diseases? The next year, NIDDK, they were seeing the light, if you will, and had on the role of circadian disruption, dysregulation, and diabetes. Next year, same year, National Institute on Aging got in, hey, what's the role of circadian dysregulation in aging? Not to be outdone, the National Institute of Alcohol Abuse and Alcoholism in 2011 funded, we're having to get one of these grants, so that's why I put this one in, funded a series of grants to look at the role of circadian rhythms and alcohol-induced tissue damage. This is one of my favorite workshops. The National Institute of Arthritis and Musculoskeletal and Skin Diseases. I didn't even, when they sent me an invitation, it came from NIAMSSD, and I didn't even know what it stood for. I mean, I know most of you NIHs, but that one I didn't get. And there's a reason why. I had nothing to do with skin and muscle, but there's a take-home lesson here. During my talk in 2013, the chairman of a major dermatology department in a country in a university I won't mention. He's Googling, like Michael's doing now. He's checking out what I'm saying. He's Googling me, and he goes, Fred, did you know that there's circadian clock genes in the skin cells? Gag me with a spoon. How can you be in 2013 and not know that when you're one of the leading, and this is an important point I'm going to make in one or two slides. I'm going to come back to that. How could you not? I had a chairman of an immunology department in 2011, I won't say where, who said to me after a talk, are there any rhythms in the immune system? Alex, your paper came out in, I think, 2011, 2010. I mean, are there any rhythms? He wasn't even talking about clock genes. Of course there are rhythms. All right. Oh, and then here we are today, National Institute of Environmental Health. Thank you for inviting me so I could add you to my NIH slide. So I'm not going to go into this, but I kind of really got into this from a metabolic point of view, an obesity point of view, when we published this paper in Science, that clock mutant animal that's got the bad rhythms, abnormal rhythms, it showed signs of the metabolic syndrome. So the next slide is a very important point, and you really got to take this to heart. The year later, Bart Stahls came out with a commentary in Nature Medicine. When the clock stops ticking, the metabolic syndrome explodes. That's not what's important here. And even his talking about the clock could be connected to glucose metabolism, cholesterol metabolism, triglycerides, and then he goes, you know, those are the biggies, the diabetes, cardiovascular disease. The important point is Bart Stahls. Bart Stahls is a real expert on metabolism. He's a real expert on orphan receptors and body weight regulation. Mitch Lazar at Penn in 2007, 2008 had articles in Nature. The thing is, if Fred Turek was saying that circadian clocks are important for diabetes and obesity, the field would be dead. The way the field grew is that big names, the key opinion leaders, the thought leaders, they got it real early. They came in and became a legitimate field. And I don't think we've done that. If I've got somebody in skin or cancer or immunology telling me he doesn't even know that there are rhythms, those are the people we got to bring in, not us circadian sleep people who have been doing this for 40 years. We don't impact an area of medicine in the way that the thought leaders, the leaders who have been there for 30 or 40 years. And that I think is something that I hope that this meeting and the outcome of this meeting will accomplish. Okay, I want to talk about a few environmental models because one of the title of my talk was some of the environmental models, and this was one that I find so simple it still is hard for me to believe that no one had really done this study before. We controlled when mice could eat, and this is 2009. Very simple design. We had animals eating a regular diet all the time, ad lib, high-fat diet, and these are the two key groups. The animals fed a high-fat diet during the dark. Remember, mice eat they eat about 70–80% of their calorie intake during the dark. Then this was supposed to show the cage. It didn't show up very good here. All we did was to take animals from one cage during the day, move it to a cage with food during the night, move it back to a cage with no food, and then another group, the opposite. As far as all of our measurements, the animals ate the same and were active the same amount. Nevertheless, the animals that were fed an ad lib, high-fat diet, gained more weight than regular, but the animals fed a high-fat diet during the light, the wrong time of day is what we refer to it sometimes. They gained more weight. Now this, interesting, had a huge impact in the public media. Poor Deanna, I made her keep track of it, but once she got above 700 hits, we just stopped keeping track. Because it was such an easy concept to understand. It's not only important what you eat, it's when you eat. Now, have we impacted the body weight regulation? I don't know. All I know is there's been now like 100 epidemiological studies linking eating at the wrong time of day, late at night, with obesity as well as diabetes, and same thing with sleep loss. So this is just to give you a little cartoon of what we should be doing. Here's the clock in the SCN. It's getting entrained by the sun. It's regulating the intestines, the liver, all the cells of the body. And it also regulates when we eat. And when everything's in synchrony, we're good. But we're the species that says, hey, I'm going to eat when I want to eat. And then this is going to be affecting such that now the clock in the brain, regulated by the light-dark cycle, out of synchrony with the tissues of the body. And now the tissues of the body are out of synchrony with each other depending upon whether they're regulated by the clock or the sleep-wake cycle or the timing of feeding. And what are all the implications of that? And another cartoon to give you this idea that we are unusual. I was watching a show with my son on baboons when our paper came out, and I've noticed what baboons do. They eat all day. And I ran to the lab and I said, Jana, could you get me a lab of what baboons do at night? That's the baboon at night. They don't eat at night. We eat at night. What are the physiological implications of that? So when one thinks of body weight regulation, sometimes I put diet and exercise in such small letters you can't read them, but I don't believe that. I think diet and exercise are important. What people are forgetting is what the important, not recognizing. Forgetting is not the right word, because then you would have had to recognize it. What is the role of the clock? What is the role of sleep in body weight regulation? Okay, I want to take a few minutes just to show you that this is not just about obesity. I'm not talking about cancer. Other people are talking about cancer. This is a study we did in 1998, so that's almost 20 years ago. We took hamsters, put them on a light-dark cycle, and we had other hamsters that we flew to Beijing, Chicago, Beijing, Chicago, Beijing, Chicago. Of course, we didn't have to do that. We just had to shift the light-dark cycle. This was a strain of hamsters that develops cardiovascular disease and dies early, and what we demonstrated was that the animals we were phase shifting died earlier. So if you disrupt the circadian clock and you've already got a genetic predisposition to cardiovascular disease, you're in trouble. In about 2007, I started working with Ali Kazavazarian at Rush, and he said he's interested in circadian disruption and human GI disorders, and I said, what's your animal model? And he told me about this drug, DSS, that when you give it, you create severe colitis. So we had animals that we shifted every week, just like you saw the hamsters going to Beijing, Chicago, Beijing, Chicago. The animals, after 90 days of being shifted, they weigh the same amount. But then we challenged them for 7 days with this drug, DSS, and the animals that we had shifted had twice as much, or had more, I should say, weight loss and more mortality than those animals were not shifted. This is what I call a double hit. That is, if you disrupt rhythms and you already have a weakened condition, gastrointestinal problem, cardiovascular problem, pancreatic problem, then you're just exasperating. You may not be causing the disease, but you're causing the symptoms to be worse. And then we've done work looking at gut leakiness, which is very bad. I'll just tell you that. I won't go into that. In animals that are treated with alcohol, and the non-shifted animals have a certain amount of gut leakiness. The shifted animals, light dark cycle, keep shifting the light dark cycle, twice as much. Clock mutant animals, genetic disruption. Whole new area. We were funded by the March of Dimes, so they were interested in temporal disorganization. So we put mice, who the gestation is about 20 days, a light dark cycle, another group of mice, phase delay the light dark cycle every 5 days. Implantation takes place at about day 5 in the mouse and in the human. And then another group was phase advanced. And you could see just by this huge effect of the pregnancy outcome by phase shifting the light dark cycle of these mice while they were pregnant. I think this has very important implications for infertility in humans, which has occasionally been linked to shift workers and nurses and that. But I think that this is another area where it's just waiting to be looked at. Now, as everybody knows, the world of the microbiome has achieved a tremendous interest in the last decade or so. And so Martha Vita-Turner, she did one of these, how many hits, if I take microbiome and put in bone, in June of 2015, there have been 38 papers, stress 142, bowel, as you might expect, 495. You work your way up here, circadian 1. So there was one paper, that was our paper in 2014. So and 4 or 5 papers on sleep. So probably we're there's data coming out of a couple labs now, disrupting the circadian system is disrupting the microbiome. The microbiome has been linked with both mental and physical disorders. And that's how I got involved in the Scott and Kelly twin study, Scott and Mark Kelly twin study, to look at their microbiota. And I'll just say that we've looked at and shown that there's less diversity and less evenness in the microbiota in animals that are shifted or not shifted. Okay, I made the point that it's not just shift workers, it's not just jet lag, social jet lag. I mean, this is a phenomenon the term was coined by Till Ronenberg in Germany, and that's when you look at when do people sleep and are they awake during their weekdays, you see here, and then what do they do on the weekends? And you can see that there's a big change in the time they go to sleep and the time they wake. Some of these people are essentially flying 3 to 4 time zones on Friday and 3 to 4 back on Monday every day for years and years and years. And until using mass data collection, using the web, using online data collection has demonstrated links with obesity and I think diabetes, and I'm sure he's going to find links with cancer as he begins to look at these other disease states in these kinds of studies. And I'm very close to the end now. There were a couple of tunes that I wanted to kind of get across to you. I thought this was a very nice couple of quotes from an article in 2011. Circadian rhythmicity reigns across the spectrum of human life, from gene transcription to the cell nucleus, to organ function, behavior, and demography. I'm not quite sure what he means by demography, but I think I could figure it out. But I love this phrase here. How naive of mankind to think that induction of chaos in this ancient and ubiquitous timing system could come without significant physiological consequences. I really like that statement. And I didn't want, I mean, Randy, for you and me and a few other people in the room, I didn't want us to forget there are things like seasonal cycles. Randy, in fact, has the only really good paper showing that the length of the day affects the microbiota in Siberian hamsters, published in 2015. And I'm not going to go into it because that's not why we're here. I'm just saying that I think 20 years from now we're going to have a meeting. Well, I may not be here, but you guys will have a meeting 20 years from now in which you're going to look at, gee, nobody's looked at the role of seasonality. There certainly have been some studies out there, some big epidemiological studies linking seasonal disorder and heart attack, for example. Seasonal rhythms and heart attack. But I think that's coming. And then this paper came out, melatonin contributes to seasonality of multiple sclerosis. I mean, I think it's just going to be an explosion over 20 years. And I didn't want to end without mentioning my mentor, Turek, who in 1959, I'm paraphrasing him here, it seems plausible to us, 1959, that if the efficiency of the cell was compromised, as occurs during aging, disease state, the overall activity which pursues an oscillatory course, it would impair coordination of constituent cycling intracellular processes. And we're there now. We understand that. So I think we've reached a whole new era. I call it circadian medicine, where you disrupt the clock. Yeah, that we disrupt the sleep-wake cycle, shift work, but now we begin to realize we're disrupting across peripherals and brain tissues. This is a new frontier for medicine. It's why we're here, which can affect human mental and physical health at many levels, and depending on which group I'm talking to, I could have changed this to cancer. And then I think where we are right now is in what I call the Da Vinci state. Da Vinci drew a helicopter 500 years ago. He had a helicopter. We have the circadian clock genes. We have the blueprint. What is the role in health? Now, I remind myself, it took 500 years to build the helicopter. Are we going to take 500 years to bring circadian rhythms to medicine? I usually tell the young people in the room, please, please, don't take 500 years to do this. So we're at a tipping point. Are we going to bring circadian medicine and circadian health? To put it in perspective, in 1972, there were 0 sleep clinics in the United States. Now there are over 6,000. But you know what they do? They treat people with sleep problems. They don't treat people who have a health problem who can't sleep. So if somebody has fibromyalgia and they can't sleep well, people are trying to treat the fibromyalgia. But be that as it may, there are at least 6,000 sleep clinics that are treating people with sleep disorders. There are 0 circadian clinics in the United States following multiple rhythms. When is your pancreas out of synchrony with your liver? It's actually not true. There's now 1. Dr. Phyllis Z at Northwestern has started a clinic, the Center for, she's also started the Center for Circadian Sleep Medicine, but she has started the first circadian clinic that I'm aware of in the United States. And a couple of her lieutenants are working with her, but she's really the brains of the operation. So like I said, I think we've entered a new era. What role is the circadian clock system going to play in personalized medicine? We got to figure that out. All right, I'll just thank some of the people who, some of the data I showed, Ravi Alada. Joe Bass really brought me into the metabolic era. Katema Paul was one of my postdocs who did a great job now at Morehouse. Joe Takahashi and Martha Vita Turner were there with the clock story from the beginning. Phyllis taught me everything I know about sleep, my colleagues at Rush, and a number of students, particularly Deanna Arbel, involved in metabolism, Keith Suma involved in the gastrointestinal tract. So it's sometimes I think I'm a gadfly because I can be doing a GI study one day and I can be doing a neurological disorder the next day, but it all is tied in to the circadian clock system. So hopefully we as a collectively will be able to come up with where we should be going in the future. Thank you.
Thank you. If you want to hold on just a second, Dr. Turek, I think we have a few minutes if anyone has any clarification questions or follow-up questions from Dr. Turek's talk.
How do you plan to handle the discussion? The discussions will then be, we'll put our microphones on and then we'll each talk, or what? What's the plan?
Right. I'll pose the question and then I'll just move through in alphabetical order through the key discussants, and then once you've all had that and allow some crosstalk, then we'll go back and open it up to the whole panel. Did you have a question, Mike?
It's more of a comment. You're at the National Toxicology Program, and we're mostly toxicologists. It's been known that circadian rhythm, when you're exposed to a chemical, actually impacts its toxicity. Some chemicals are metabolized by glutathione pathways. And when you have glutathione cycles in the liver, so depending on when you time your exposure, that could impact the toxicity of the chemical. So when we're thinking about occupational, that might be something else to think about, what people are exposed to and what's happening in their circadian rhythm.
Yeah, and it's actually remarkable because we knew since around 1960 that if you give a drug at one time of day, you can have a positive effect on whatever, let's say you're inducing a tumor, and at another time of day, same dose kills the animal. And really, that's called chronopharmacology, which is a very important part. I like to think of what we're talking about as a little bit different here, disrupt the circadian clock and how do we disrupt health and disease. But the idea that giving a drug at one time of day, it'll be more effective. Okay, that's done, I believe, in the asthma world, but it's really not mainstream. And that's Pitt and Drake one time, because Franz Hallberg was one of the leaders of this field who died recently, and Pitt and Drake said to me that Hallberg had half a ticket to Stockholm in the 1970s, but it never caught on. And I would argue that it didn't catch on, particularly in oncology, because the oncologists didn't buy in. And if they didn't buy in, you didn't get a change in the movement. And I was at NCI a couple of years ago, and we were discussing this, and I think, in fact, that's one of the things I hope I can learn from this, how the National Toxicology Program at NCI are working together to bring this new era almost for cancer treatment, where you're really taking into account, and even to the point at a personal level, personal circadian level, this drug is going to be more effective at this time of day in treating my cancer in this subset of people who are showing these rhythmic phenomenon in pathways that are involved in prostate cancer, whereas others, well, maybe the drug would be at a different time of day. When are we going to try to begin to move into that era? That's a great point. Thank you.
Just a comment. I have a lot of spare time, so I decided to read through the PD, the physician desk reference, and found there were about 300 medications in the physician desk reference that are specified according to the time of day they should be used. That was a shock to me. Many of them have to do because they're practical applications, but many of them have to do because of the biological rhythms involved, and there is even a chronotherapeutic application for involving for women of timing not only about time of day, but at different times of the menstrual cycle. So the concept is there, it's just nobody knows about it. And the first real chronotherapy, which was used not only in this country but worldwide, was the alternate day morning cortical therapy introduced by John Harder and his colleagues at Bremen, Harvard, and then actually marketed by the then Upjohn Pharmaceutical Company, which doesn't exist. But there are many chronotherapies, but the point, it's not to talk about that, but what you so nicely presented is the importance of the circadian system in terms of having biomarkers if we're going to do individualized or precise medicine, to know to give the right drug to the right person for the right reason at the right time, biological time. So there's many overlaps of this presentation and this meeting in terms of circadian synchrony or disruption in terms of not only cancer therapy, but everyday common therapy. Because we even know that when we take aspirins, there's several studies, and even studies showing that low-dose aspirin at night for mild hypertensives can actually normalize blood pressure.
Yeah, let me just add to that by saying that John Hogenash published a paper last year. Remember, I said he's the one who said that 50% of all genes are cycling, and he's come up with that 80% of all drugs target a receptor or a kinase or some cellular property that's cycling, so that the drugs, the 80% of the drugs that are being used are actually more likely to be targeting cycling genes than non-cycling genes, and that's just a paper he published a few months ago.
And again, another important point is if you give the drug at the wrong time, and an example is a synthetic corticosteroid, let's say prednisone. If you give that to a person who's diurnally active and give that before bedtime, you're going to knock out your adrenals depending on the dose and duration of treatment, whereas if you get in the morning, at the start of the activity span, in a moderate to low dose, you're not going to have any suppression or knock out that, what I would like to think of as a major secondary oscillator, the adrenal cortex.
Mike, do you have a question?
Okay, any other questions? Okay, we'll move on to the discussion section. Thank you, Dr. Turek.